August 17, 1977, 9:23 a.m., Beverly Hills, California. For 6 hours straight, the telephone had been ringing relentlessly. Dean Martin remained motionless in his leather chair, staring blankly at the wall, deliberately letting each call go unanswered. He already understood the nature of these calls. Since 4:47 p.m. the previous day, when his manager had delivered the devastating news, he knew exactly what people wanted. Elvis Aaron Presley, only 42 years old, had been discovered on the bathroom floor at Graceland by his girlfriend Ginger Alden. While cardiac arrhythmia would become the official medical explanation, Dean recognized a far deeper, more intricate truth. It was something he understood with a depth few others could ever comprehend. Finally, the phone rang again. This time, Dean's hand reached out. The caller introduced herself as Linda Thompson, her voice measured yet burdened with sorrow, representing the Presley family. Dean closed his eyes and listened intently. The funeral was scheduled for August 18th at Graceland. Priscilla, Elvis's ex-wife, had requested his presence to perform. She had one specific request. He sing "Everybody Loves Somebody," Elvis's beloved version that Dean had made famous. His grip tightened on the receiver. Nearly 30 seconds of silence followed. Finally, Dean spoke. His answer was definitive. He could not do this. He would not sing at the funeral. His refusal spread like wildfire through Hollywood. By midday, reporters crowded outside his Beverly Hills residence. That evening, the story dominated national news. Dean Martin refuses to perform at Elvis Presley's funeral. Media outlets portrayed him as cold, ungracious, someone too bitter to set aside their well-known rivalry, even in death. The public narrative was uniformly negative. Back at Graceland, Priscilla received this news at 2:15 p.m. Memphis time. Surrounded by relatives and confidants in the mansion's living room, she was attempting to organize a funeral for a man who had transcended mortality in the public imagination. Her voice barely audible, Priscilla expressed her bewilderment. Elvis had constantly spoken about Dean, always with affection. He had maintained that Dean was Hollywood's sole representative who treated him as a genuine human being rather than a commodity to exploit. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, offered a quiet observation from where he sat in the corner, appearing decades older than his actual years. Perhaps, Vernon suggested, Dean loved Elvis too profoundly to perform while his body lay within that casket. Grief, Vernon explained, sometimes compelled people to reject precisely what they most needed. Priscilla made an instantaneous choice. She demanded Dean Martin's personal telephone number, not through his representative or agent, but direct. If necessary, she would travel to California herself. She intended to comprehend his reasoning. At 8:47 p.m. Pacific Time, Dean's phone rang. Something within him prompted him to answer. Priscilla's voice came through, introducing herself. She had not called seeking sympathy. She needed clarification. Elvis, she explained, had spoken about Dean constantly. Elvis had described Dean as his brother. Dean's voice grew strained. What he was about to reveal, he had never shared with anyone, not his spouse, not his offspring, not a solitary individual on earth except Elvis himself. Then he began recounting the events of 1968, 9 years prior, when everything had transformed. Dean Martin raced through hospital corridors in his formal evening wear, still dressed from the NBC television special he had abandoned when the call arrived. His 21-year-old son, Dean Paul, had suffered a serious automobile collision on Mulholland Drive. Critical injuries. The medical team couldn't guarantee survival through the night. He burst into the intensive care unit to find his wife Jean already present, her face streaked with makeup, rosary beads clasped in trembling hands. Through the observation window, Dean observed his son lying unconscious amid a landscape of medical apparatus. Tubes, monitors, ventilators delivering artificial breath. Blood-soaked bandages wrapped his skull. The attending physician had informed him of severe cerebral swelling, possible surgical intervention. With no certainty of recovery, a nurse approached. Someone had come to see him. Dean declined. The nurse persisted. This visitor had predicted that exact response and had sent a message about brothers supporting brothers through darkness. Dean turned. Standing at the corridor's end, Still wearing his Las Vegas performance costume stood Elvis Presley. He had abandoned a sold-out concert and driven through the night because he could not bear Dean facing this catastrophe alone. Dean's voice fractured as he questioned Elvis's presence. Elvis responded simply. He was being a brother. The two men sat together through 6 endless hours, through shift transitions, bitter vending machine coffee, the oppressive silence of crisis. At 5:47 a.m., a physician emerged. Dean Paul had regained consciousness. The swelling was diminishing. Against all expectations, he remained alert, asking for his father. Dean grasped Elvis's hand firmly. He expressed the magnitude of his debt. Elvis deflected the gratitude, insisting only that Dean go to his son. When Dean entered that ICU room and witnessed his son's eyes open alive, searching for his face, he collapsed to his knees, overcome with gratitude. Yet he remained unaware of what Elvis had orchestrated while he wept in that hallway. He didn't know about the urgent telephone calls, the renowned specialist summoned from Johns Hopkins, the revolutionary experimental treatment financed entirely from Elvis's personal resources, a treatment unavailable anywhere else in California, a procedure that almost certainly rescued his son's existence. Elvis mentioned nothing of these actions. He expected no recognition or compensation. 3 months passed. Dean Paul had completely recovered, walking, communicating, preparing for his service in the California Air National Guard. During a routine follow-up appointment, a hospital administrator casually mentioned the Presley payment. Dean's entire body went rigid. What Presley payment? The administrator's complexion paled. The administrator stammered an apology, then revealed the truth. Mr. Presley had covered every expense. The Baltimore neurosurgeon, the innovative pharmaceuticals, round-the-clock specialized nursing. The total amount exceeded $200,000. Elvis had sworn the hospital to absolute secrecy. Dean drove directly to Las Vegas. He located Elvis between performances at the International Hotel and entered his dressing room without permission. His voice shook as he demanded explanation. Why had Elvis concealed this tremendous gesture? Elvis remained serene, observing Dean from his mirror. It wasn't about acknowledgement, he explained. It was about family. Dean's bewilderment intensified. They were scarcely acquaintances. Years earlier, Dean had expressed harsh judgments about Elvis. Elvis rose and placed his hands upon Dean's shoulders. He shared an extraordinary revelation. Dean's mother had given Elvis's mother a coat decades earlier, in 1923 in Ohio, when she possessed nothing. Elvis's mother, Gladys, had recounted this act of compassion repeatedly and had made Elvis promise to repay such kindness whenever circumstances permitted. Dean's son required assistance. Elvis possessed the resources. Therefore, Elvis had acted. Dean Martin, whose reputation was constructed on emotional restraint, collapsed against Elvis, weeping uncontrollably. He couldn't articulate his gratitude. Elvis made a single request. When Elvis departed this world, remember him as family, not as competitor or adversary, but as genuine kinship. Dean promised. They shook hands on this covenant. For 9 subsequent years, they maintained this brotherhood through clandestine phone conversations and private encounters, a bond neither acknowledged publicly until August 16, 1977, when Elvis departed Earth. The service occurred in Graceland's living room. Only 15 attendees were present. Genuine intimates who had understood the authentic Elvis beyond the public persona. Dean Martin was absent, remaining in Beverly Hills, seated in that familiar leather chair, watching television coverage, immobilized by memory and emotion. On screen, Priscilla proceeded past Elvis's casket, her face a portrait of constrained suffering. Young Lisa Marie, merely 9 years old, grasped her mother's hand, too innocent to comprehend permanent loss. Outside, thousands maintained vigils with flowers and candles, crowds stretching for miles, mourning a figure most had never encountered personally. Dean sat motionless, untouched bourbon glass in hand, feeling profoundly cowardly. Eventually, the telephone rang. After hesitation, Dean answered. The caller was Priscilla. She had disclosed everything to Elvis's family. The 1968 hospital crisis, Elvis's anonymous financial intervention, the $200,000 expenditure, Elvis's self-perception as Dean's brother. Vernon had wept upon hearing this account. The family now comprehended that Dean's refusal to perform was not disrespect, but love, a brother protecting another brother's memory of selfless giving. Vernon had always intuited that Elvis performed countless kindnesses without publicity, but this revelation shocked everyone. Dean's tears flowed freely. Elvis had required him to preserve their brotherhood's memory. By declining to perform, Dean feared he was betraying that sacred commitment. Priscilla contradicted him gently. He was honoring Elvis precisely as Elvis would have desired. Then Priscilla shared something remarkable. Elvis had maintained a photograph in his Graceland dressing room. 2 women standing before a residence. Inscribed on the reverse, Angela and Gladys, summer 1923, sisters of the soul. Dean inhaled sharply. He possessed that identical photograph. He examined it daily. Elvis had once explained that it represented kindness transcending generations, each action producing ripples extending infinitely forward. Elvis had never disclosed that he possessed his own copy. Priscilla wanted Dean to understand. Their mothers had orchestrated their brotherhood. Now, somewhere beyond mortality, they watched over both men. Priscilla had to depart for the service. But before disconnecting, she wanted Dean to understand something crucial. Elvis had loved him profoundly, discussing him constantly. Elvis maintained that Dean was Hollywood's singular person who perceived him as individual rather than manufactured product. Elvis expressed daily gratitude that Dean's mother's ancient charity had gifted him with a brother. Dean couldn't articulate response. The emotion eclipsed language. Dean kneeled for the first occasion in 40 years. His prayers encompassed Elvis's eternal rest, Priscilla's fortitude, Lisa Marie's tomorrow. He prayed for Dean Paul, alive solely because Elvis had financed miraculous intervention. He prayed for 2 women whose 1923 connection had created bonds persisting across decades, generations, and death itself. Upon rising, transformation had occurred internally. Grief persisted. Loss remained unbearable. Yet gratitude now accompanied the anguish, not simply for Elvis's actions, but for who Elvis had demonstrated himself to be, a man dispensing generosity without expecting recognition, a man offering love without demanding reciprocation, a man comprehending that authentic kindness never requests acknowledgement. For months had elapsed since Elvis's passing. Dean had performed minimally, departing his residence infrequently. Industry insiders speculated about his retirement, claiming his vitality had evaporated. They possessed partial accuracy. Dean would never remain unchanged, though not in ways they anticipated. Christmas morning arrived. His family congregated in his living room. Wife Jean, his children and grandchildren. Decorations adorned the tree. Presents remained wrapped. Everything appeared ordinary, yet Dean had prepared one final offering. He approached the piano positioned in the room's corner. He seated himself on the bench. For the first time since August 16th, his fingers commenced moving across the keys. He performed Everybody Loves Somebody, the composition Priscilla had requested at the funeral, the melody he had been unable to deliver. His family observed in stunned astonishment as Dean's hands navigated the keyboard. His vocal timbre emerged rough initially, fractured by months of silence and bereavement. Yet as performance progressed, something commenced mending. He wasn't merely executing a tune. He was singing toward Elvis, toward Gladys, toward Angela, toward every individual who had demonstrated compassion to strangers without requesting recompense. When the ultimate chorus concluded, every occupant in the room experienced tears, including Dean. Yet these represented release rather than anguish, gratitude superseding sorrow, affection transcending death itself. Dean Paul approached his father and knelt beside the piano bench. He termed performance beautiful. Dean regarded his son, the child who had perished in 1968, who lived exclusively because Elvis Presley acknowledged that compassion should extend across generations. Dean declared his complete indebtedness to Elvis. His son responded that he recognized this, that Elvis had salvaged his existence. Dean questioned how his son understood. Dean Paul disclosed that he had learned years prior, during a hospital appointment when an administrator mentioned the Presley payment. He had recognized the gravity of the situation and had honored both his father's and Elvis's discretion by maintaining silence. Dean embraced his son intensely, an embrace he should have offered Elvis, an embrace he desperately wished he could still extend to his brother. Dean committed himself to honoring Elvis perpetually, endeavoring daily to embody the individual Elvis had believed he possessed capacity to become. Dean Martin continued performing for the subsequent decade following Elvis's passing. He never publicly disclosed their friendship, never exposed Elvis's secret financial intervention on behalf of Dean Paul. That knowledge accompanied him to death. Yet those genuinely intimate with Dean recognized his transformation. Post-1977, he demonstrated increased tenderness, expanded compassion, and heightened willingness to assist emerging entertainers without anticipating reciprocal advantage. He established an anonymous scholarship program for music scholars in 1978, requiring sole obligation. Recipients must render assistance to others when circumstances permitted. He designated it the Ripple Forward Foundation. His family alone understood the inspiration. March 21st, 1987, brought shattering loss. Dean Paul's fighter jet crashed during military training. He was 35 years old, precisely Elvis's age when he had rescued him. Dean never psychologically recovered. Performance ceased. He abandoned his residence. The public facade of life as perpetual celebration disintegrated. Christmas Day 1995 concluded his existence. That identical date, years prior, when he had ultimately performed Everybody Loves Somebody for his family. That identical date when he had committed to perpetuating Elvis's memory. When he passed, something remarkable remained in his possession. That vintage photograph, worn and creased, depicting two women positioned before an Ohio residence. The inscription read, Angela and Gladys, Summer 1923, Sisters of the Soul. Dean had carried this image daily since Elvis's death, 18 years preserving that connection. They interred it alongside him because certain bonds transcend mortality itself. This constitutes the authentic narrative of Dean Martin and Elvis Presley, not the rivalry consuming headlines, not the public animosity generating newspaper sales. The genuine narrative involves two mothers evolving into sisters, two offspring becoming brothers, and a compassionate gesture whose consequences extended across 50 years, rescuing lives and mending spirits perpetually. If this account resonated with you, subscribe immediately and activate notifications. Stories exposing concealed connections between legendary figures deserve broader circulation. Comment below. Share kindnesses that transformed your existence. Recount bonds defining your journey. Your narrative may inspire countless others. Forward this to individuals harboring unexpressed sorrow, those requiring understanding that love surmounts every barrier, even mortality. This channel exists for discovering authentic narratives beneath legendary personas, uncovering humanity concealed behind renown, and recognizing that every compassionate gesture generates consequences extending infinitely beyond our comprehension.